Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this edition of our NEST webinar series. So just a brief overview of the NEST webinars. It's a series of webinars to communicate some of the foundational concepts and current debates in sustainable solutions research. And the aim is really to create a resource for early career researchers and facilitate interaction with established scholars and let them disseminate their ideas sort of across the STRN community. And also it's a good space for us to sort of discuss things afterwards, have a Q&A. So, sorry. So yeah, just the upcoming webinars. We have a webinar in May with Katarina Holscher. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, probably not, on transformative urban governance and governance capacities. So we're really looking forward to having Katarina come and speak to us. And then we'll have the webinar in June. And then we're going to take a break over summer for a couple of months because everyone's usually away or busy. And then we're going to line up some more interesting speakers for the autumn. So yeah, as we always say, we're really interested to, invite scholars or hear from people who are based maybe outside of Europe, North America and Australia. We're also in the community regarding areas of study, people they would like to hear, speaking, presenting, or areas that they feel are under addressed within ST research. And if you want to reach out to us and suggest anyone, please feel free at any time. So on to today, we have Dr. Josie Chambers from Utrecht University, who's going to present on the power of art and transitions research. So Josie Chambers is an assistant professor in the Urban Future Studio at the Copernicus Institute for Sustainable Development. Her research examines how critical and artistic approaches can challenge notions of inevitable, unjust futures and enable radical imagination and transformative politics. She does so in collaboration with diverse societal actors, as in the African Urban Futures Project, and shares her insights in the blog Utopian Pulses. Josie also uses creative pedagogies to transform the classroom space, leading to student-led outputs such as the creative collectives for Utopia Zine and Rural Utopia's theatrical event. Prior to joining UU, Josie completed a PhD fellowship at the University of Cambridge and worked for 2 years as a postdoctoral researcher at Wageningen, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, University, on strengthening the transformative role of research in society. So after that, I guess over to you, Josie. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. And really nice to be here and to meet many people across this network as well. Having kind of for the first time entered this network in the conference last August for anyone who was present, which is actually how Dan and I first met. And we thought, oh, this would be a nice webinar to do. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm also going to try to share my sound. So I hope that that works okay. Just give me 1 second. Share sound. Okay, can you see a presentation? Yes. Okay, perfect. Great. Yeah, I thought I could talk for about a half hour about how I've been approaching trying to bring together my research world and my background as a social scientist, especially in the transdisciplinary space, and how that's come together with my creative and artistic self. And I'm going to keep this quite personal in the sense of sharing various personal stories and examples of how I've been experimenting with this. But I'll also point to some of the potential that I see that I personally find most exciting about what we can do with the intersection of artistic and research approaches. And as Dan already mentioned, I'm at the Urban Future Studio, so I've been there for 2 years. And that is a really wonderful, creative, transdisciplinary social science space where our main mandate is really to explore how people often have very particular ideas about what futures might be possible or desirable. And we try to both take a critical perspective on how we often narrow our images of possible and desirable futures in ways that might limit our action in the present. But then also we engage in creative approaches to hopefully expand our collective notions of what is possible that hopefully is also desirable in a more collective sense. I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to my entry point into both of these sides. So this is actually a screenshot of the video of my first performance when I was 6 years old, and I was performing Rock Around the Clock for the first year talent show. And there's actually a part in this video where I even have a little electric guitar solo on my cardboard guitar. And I think my mom made my entire outfit there with the poodle skirt. But this is really just something I've loved music and have loved singing for my entire life. But this is something that was always kind of on the side. So when I was trying to choose what I wanted to study in undergrad, it was between music and biology. And in the end, I decided actually to go more in the direction of biology because it felt like a much more, I don't know, stable, serious prospect going forward. And maybe also I kind of liked the idea of not having too much pressure on that creative artistic side. And so as a result, kind of going forward, I didn't really see how that music artistic side could enter into my initial work in a honeybee genomics lab and as a biologist. And then over time, as I kind of shifted more into, originally into studying primates in the wild, and then looking more at nature conservation interventions and programs, and then more into the politics of interventions, and then actually asking more questions about, well, how do we co-design interventions that are hoping to do something positive for people in the environment? And then as I kind of got into imagination and futures, and really exploring the importance of diverse perspectives and how we approach social and environmental issues. This is what actually enabled me to finally bring my artistic and creative self back into who I was and who I wanted to be as a researcher. And I would say now, instead of seeing them very much as separate, I really like this quote from Susan Finley. I would say, yes, I'm an artist, but yes, I am also a researcher. And I've discovered that these two selves are not separate. And so I really value how being an artist as researcher and researcher as artist, so how each of these really kind of inform and can enrich each practice in the way that it opens up what we can do both in research but also in creative practice. And I think that this can feel really challenging to cross this divide, especially because it's often framed as a binary. So we very often use this language of art science, which already with the dash in between, which already kind of puts each practice separated and on each side. And so I've been, in a way, actually trying to use this phrase less often, but then it also becomes a little bit confusing about what to use, because if you talk about art research, and maybe research seems like a little bit of a broader framing than science, then that can also sound kind of like historical or historical research on art. So I think it's important that we also kind of innovate the way that we talk about these connections, whether it's artistic research practice or how exactly we want to frame that. This is just from the other week with a group of wonderful PhD candidates in the institute that I work in, Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development. We discussed together what are some of the words that we often identify with being a researcher versus being an artist. And you can see from this list here, the researcher side, we have various things like creativity, systematic, curiosity, problem solving, analytical. There's a little bit of objective there, critical, observation. And then on the artist side, you can see that people said words more like, freedom, intuitive, relaxed, fun, experimental, subconscious, interactive, playful, engaged. And of course, as we started talking about this more and more, it really becomes evident how much of a problematic binary it is that we try to keep these things separate, because of course artistic practice can be deeply systematic, also problem solving and finding, and of course research can be so creative and engaged. So there are really so many different fruitful linkages across this. And in a way, like if we do take a view of research that's limited to some conception of it being objective or rational, we are really like excluding or actively keeping the potential of artistic and more open ways of engaging in research completely to the side. So I really think it's fruitful to try to go beyond this sort of binary expression. And this is so this is a drawing that a PhD candidate who I had the opportunity to know several years back. She drew this to show how she's been increasingly so Sina, how she's been increasingly intertwining her natural scientist ecologist self, which is kind of the picture on the left of the tree that's a little bit more maybe linear or data oriented, and who she sees herself as an educator, and also the creative work that she does through working with youth around nature conservation issues, where you can see it's a completely different kind of interpretation of what a tree might embody or might feel like, and the importance of intertangling these different identities to see what sorts of seeds can emerge from it. And that from switching from these different roles, there's really a discrepancy how we notice the world and experience the world around us, whether we're in a more scientific or more of an artist identity, and the benefits of really trying to not keep these separate. There are all sorts of different books that I find especially inspirational, that I find really conceptually intriguing and rich, and also very artistic in the way that they're expressed. So I thought I would just flag one book that I've especially recently been reading called, so it flips Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. Julio Cortázar flipped this in 1967 into Around the Day in 80 Worlds. And so instead of kind of showing an adventure, explorer journey around the single globe, you actually kind of get this window into all sorts of different imaginative, but also very mundane and kind of real ways of seeing the world, but from very different angles. And kind of he purposefully tries to make it not into some sort of coherent trip around the world. And you can see, as he says in this text, there's not much coherence, or do not expect too much coherence from this trip around the day. Some of my 80 worlds are small, old planets where I once arrived long ago. And in one of his short stories called The Chameleon Station, I really appreciate how he paints the identity or the role of the poet. And just one of the many things that he shares, I just chose to share this one quote, where he says, "It so happens that the artist also has ideas, but it is rare that he has them systematically, that he has been," use this term, coleopterized, like a beetle, to the point of eliminating all contradictions the way philosophical or political coleoptera have. And at least what I take about what he's trying to show or explore here is how so often in science we have kind of the pressure to narrow down, to claim very particular truths or categories or harden the boundaries. And the benefit of taking a more artistic view on things is actually having a lot more comfort with the discomfort that there might be multiple truths or multiple perspectives, and being much more comfortable about sitting with and exploring different contradictions and different perspectives, instead of feeling like you need to kind of immediately search for the single truth or the single way to eliminate all contradictions. And so I think the interplay between the scientific rigor of exploring things, but then also this comfort with contradiction, is a really important aspect of how art and science can come together. So for me personally, my angle that I'm especially excited about at the intersection of research, art, and creativity is really collective imagination. So how does it open up our ideas and perspectives about what is possible in the world? And this is actually a font that one of my students created completely unexpectedly as part of a course that I was teaching. So I think it's also a nice example of how when you actually create spaces for creativity in the classroom or through assignments, all sorts of unexpected expressions come out. Where now there's even a downloadable font called Luca that she made herself that has I think a really amazing and creative expression. But back to the main, I think, potential that there is. And I think we often have we can have quite a passive imagination where we think that we are being radical in what we imagine, or we assume that if we imagine in a space, it's somehow going to translate into the real world. But I'm really interested in a very active sense of imagination, of how can we imagine in ways that where it also burns with passion, where we feel like we need to act and actually do things in the world, precisely because how we're imagining is actually part of being and relating in the world. So for the rest of the talk, I wanted to actually share a few different ways of looking at this relationship between art and science in terms of the role of art, because I think actually we can give art a very different sort of role in how it relates with research. And so I'll just show a few kind of personal examples that I think speak to some of these different ways. And so this will become more apparent, these differences, but I've kind of called them, there are ways we can engage or engage with the role of art that's more closed in terms of the logic, where we see it more as a vehicle that's circulating imaginaries. We can see it more as having investigatory role, where it's a lens that's trying to reveal and surface implicit imaginaries, or we can see it as having more of an open logic, where it's more of a turbulence that disrupts dominant imaginaries, and also how we act and relate together. Which I hope that this will become a lot more apparent in a moment when I actually share concrete examples. But before that, I assume that for many of you working in the field of sustainability transitions, imaginaries will not be a new concept for you. But just in case, I wanted to briefly pause to explain what I mean by this. And I draw upon the definition introduced by Jasanoff and Kim, that imaginaries are collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. And basically what they're saying here is imaginaries is not just like a simple vision of a desirable future. It's really the social life around how such visions come into being, but also what such visions are doing, how they're reordering our social world, how they become more stabilized, potentially less questioned, or can be more questioned. So it's really that, so broader kind of social understanding around how we might think about what sorts of futures are desirable or possible. And an example that they give in one of their earlier pieces is how nuclear power, for example, there's a very different imaginary of nuclear power, its desirability, its role, what it even means in the US versus a South Korea context, and that this is inherently linked to completely different sorts of policy responses. And so, that's just kind of one particular example of how imaginaries matter so much in the world. So I'll just give a quick, at least kind of one or two quick examples of each of these. So if we view the role of art in a more closed way, where we're trying to kind of circulate an imaginary that we think should be out there more in the world, I think one example of this is Dance Your PhD. And I just, I just put a brief YouTube clip here of the 2024 winner. So if anyone wants to follow that up, you can Google that and you'll find it. So Dr. Wellington Minario Costa used the power of dance and also very colorful outfits and choreographies to show the diversity of personality types in kangaroos, and also their improvisation in the way that they're interacting with each other. So I think that that's a really interesting example of how you can take a particular research or scientific concept, and maybe you think that it's important that that understanding is more present out in the world, and you want to share that. So you engage with a really creative artistic practice to explore that, and then to capture, in this case, a video to share of dance, to share with the world and make that more prevalent and kind of circulate that. I've also experimented with this myself. So as I was writing up one of the papers that came out of some of my postdoc work on co-production, we had looked at all sorts of cases around the world. And coming out of the analysis, we noticed that there were different sorts of archetypes of ways of engaging in collaborations that could often hinder and close down the potential for transformations. And so we took those archetypes, and I, together with my friend Noor, who we used to play music together back in Cambridge. It was actually during the pandemic that I called him up and I said, Noor, what would you think of trying to kind of musically explore what this concept of co-productive agility might mean? And so we ended up trying to translate these different concepts into musical expression. So for example, the hero who is so sure of how problems and solutions might be framed, and therefore can really push their own agenda forward and be closed to questioning or navigating tensions in the way that could facilitate or enable transformation. Then we thought about, what might that hero sound like? And so Noor, to start, he kind of said, well, Josie, if you were to step in the hero role, how would you translate that into a musical line? And so I played around for a bit, and then I sent Noor this clip here, which I hope it plays. Let's see.
Problem, solve it, ooh, solve it, ooh, solve it, yeah, problem, solve it, ooh, solve it, ooh, solve it, yeah, problem.
Okay, and so then Noor, so he got that, and then he thought, oh, well, this genie character that's really kind of helping or enabling the hero, which could be, for example, a researcher that takes a societal question and just kind of answers it, as opposed to critically questioning that in the first place. The genie, Noor added his baseline to it to kind of further strengthen that loop. And then we thought about, this host role that's kind of creating space where others can interact. Maybe that's kind of like the percussion section. So we're added. And then for more of this woodpecker role that creates more antagonism with the hero that's kind of so sure about definitions of what problems or solutions are important. How can that kind of come in to create some dissonance or discomfort with that, or tension with that hero line? And so Noor actually ended up taking the hero voice or loop and electronically distorting it to create some interesting sound. And if you go to if you haven't seen this yet, if you go to the YouTube link there, then you can watch the whole musical abstract, and it shows this journey from experiencing the rigidity of these archetypes or musical lines, not really like just kind of reinforcing the dominant loop, to more interesting and agile ways of relating, or at least mine and yours attempt to do that together. I'm also really interested in how we visualize the future. So I think there's a huge power of visualizations that we can create around the research that we do that can provoke people in very different sorts of ways. And so recently, I felt like when I was introduced first to the Futures Cone, which was originally popularized by Joseph Foros in 2003, even though the same model was introduced earlier. So he introduces this Futures Cone, which is this idea that as you go out into the future, the range of possible futures just gets broader and broader, and distinguishes between these different layers of futures that go from maybe ones that are much more business as usual, where we're just kind of projecting it from the past out to kind of increasingly plausible or possible. So maybe we don't think it's so likely, but we do think it's possible, out to preposterous, where we can imagine that it is a possibility, but we think it's absolutely ridiculous, or that's never going to happen. And people have further extended this by, for example, seeing this as like a flashlight, and then what's in the dark beyond it is even what we can't even possibly imagine as a future. And so I always felt like this, since introduced to this, I felt a little bit uncomfortable with just kind of how only forward oriented or how linear this felt. And I could see how certain common approaches to engaging with the future, such as predictive approaches, where we're trying to like predict what we think the future is going to be like, directly extending from what's happened in the past, or backcasting, where we choose some sort of desirable future in advance and we're just kind of trying to linearly target that or design the pathway towards that. I felt like those approaches to futuring also kind of related to how we're visualizing the future, and both express certain sorts of limitations. And so this led me to kind of play with the power of visualization for, well, are there alternative ways that we can show the future? So instead of only projecting forward towards possible futures, can we show more plurality of how we actually see the present in multiple and different ways? And also, what about the past? So there are so many different dominant stories that are told about history, and there are so many forgotten stories that are never told. And then also a lot of contestation between different ways that people interpret the past. So given that the way that we imagine futures is so inextricably linked to our memories and our experiences from the past, are there ways that we can actually acknowledge the importance of both of these dimensions in terms of informing how we act in the present? And how can we not only like these questions and these arrows that I brought in on the sides, how can we really focus on the dynamics that are narrowing our visions of narrowing our imagination towards projected business as usual futures, but then also what are the techniques or the ways of facilitating us to expand our imagination of more preposterous, but also more collectively desirable futures, but also acknowledging forgotten pasts or hidden stories in relation to that. And then also, I won't really get into this other visualization, but there are just so many, I think, interesting ways of visualizing different concepts. This back to, I mentioned Julio Cortázar's Around the Day in 80 Worlds. And he kind of offers verbally a different sort of visualization, which then I put also into visual form, that actually kind of flips that futures cone where the preposterous is the most radical and we just have to expand our imagination, and actually kind of flips that by saying we have actually these dreams that we really buy into, and we need to kind of recognize those as hollow shells of dreams and learn to kind of go to sleep within those dreams, so we can actually awaken within a dream that lies within, and kind of do that more and more inward into layers. So a completely different sort of understanding growth or imagination. So I think with that closed logic, it can be really powerful to engage with the role of art to circulate imaginaries. But I think it's really important what the power dynamics are between why is that imaginary being circulated and how can the power of art actually maybe question or open up that imaginary. And so I found through visualizations or through the musical abstract that also there is really a power to how engaging in that creative process also starts to challenge your notion of what those concepts even mean in the first place, to make it a little bit less closed. I would say so for a more investigatory approach, I'm really interested in the power of art and how different approaches can help us to reveal and surface imaginaries that we don't necessarily recognize, that we hold or also that affect us. And I think just as an example of one exercise that I've done that I think speaks to this, it was part of a master's course that I ran for the first time in the autumn called Imagining the Future for Transformation. And so on the one hand, we engaged with making a collective playlist together. So music became an entry point to think about, not just think, but also feel, how do I engage with the future? What music really speaks to me, and as a collaborative effort, so that everyone could kind of share their interpretation. And you can actually, if you manage to somehow from the video type in that long Spotify link there, you can also access and listen to the playlist. But I also, before people even showed up to the first class, I also asked everyone to fill in this page however they wanted to, on how do you picture the future, and to feel free to express themselves in any way that they wanted. And I was really blown away by what people brought into that first class, because of having that creative method or that creative entry point. For example, one student made this diorama of how he envisioned himself in the future in a repair shop. Someone else made a creative, so abstract art piece about how she emotionally felt about the future and the difficulty of feeling a lot of pessimism and darkness, but also searching for kind of spots of color, spots of hope. And then someone else was experimenting with actually these generative AI tools, of how can that actually help us envision how our streets could be very different, for example, in the future. And so you can see just from these examples, by giving a creative entry point, like that actual method or way of surfacing assumptions or imaginaries in a way can be much more powerful, in terms of shaping what is actually arrived at and what is expressed, as opposed to kind of coming with a very fixed notion of what should be communicated via art. Art is actually much more the method by which we explore this. Since I just mentioned generative AI, that was actually my other example. So I've played around with these tools a little bit. I've seen people increasingly use them to imagine or visualize futures. And for me, that's made me, yeah, I guess maybe increasingly skeptical about, well, what are these tools actually doing? If this is increasingly influencing our efforts to imagine futures, is that helpful? Is that closing us down? And I think for me, the biggest concern is that it's often framed as opening up creativity or opening up imagination about what if. But actually, because it's so rooted in images and data that are from the past and that express all sorts of different biases, that are based actually on data anchored in what was. So there's a real contradiction between if we're going even further back into the biases of the past to try to imagine forward. But then I kind of played with that in a way. So in a course, also last autumn, but a different course, I worked with bachelor students in a technology and innovation course, and we use generative AI as a creative tool for a technology that students were interested in, we asked them to create a vision of the future that they saw as utopia, versus a contrasting vision of the future for that technology that they understood as being dystopian. And that was really interesting because, of course, when different images were coming up, while one student might see that as utopia, for example, so the image that's so about the future of cars that someone created, that's just on the screen there. You can see from someone else's, another student's perspective, or someone else's perspective, that could completely be a dystopia. And so I think it kind of made me realize the power of generative AI for surfacing these dominant imaginaries, like what's in our head in terms of what we find to be hugely desirable or undesirable, and it kind of even further caricaturizes that. But then, like, the importance of having these critical questions where then we can talk about, well, why do we assume this is plausible or is something desirable? Whose problems are prioritized or whose are ignored? You know, who benefits from this world? Who's not valued or loses out? I think it's pretty obvious from the picture I have in front that this is a world where, like, rich and wealthy people will benefit a lot more. And it's very kind of heavy infrastructure, not a lot of access to nature. So it's definitely a world that would not be desirable for everyone, or even, you know, a vast portion of the population. And then also kind of the underlying values of whose expertise or knowledge is important in this world. And so I think it's really important to develop these methodological approaches that can help us to be more critical as we are also creatively imagining possible futures, so that we can really think about these as boundary objects or co-designing utopia, not to come to some sort of end final desirable vision, but very much about the process of navigating these conflicting imaginaries. And speaking of these tensions, this is definitely something that I have experienced a lot, kind of this tension between more of a closed logic where conceptually you think, oh, I really want to engage with art around this concept, and also the value of engaging with art as a method that can be much more open and surface even unexpected things. So when I was teaching a course last year called Rural Utopias, I think that was a really interesting example of the difficulty of doing that, but also really remarkable also what the students came up with. And so that was a classroom of master students, policymakers, pharmacists, artists, activists. And we experimented with the role of theater as method to emerge from different deadlocks that we see around farming issues in the Netherlands. And that there was definitely a tension there, because I feel like partly there was a desire to kind of come to the notions of, okay, these would be interesting solutions in this context. How can we theatrically show that or display that, which is maybe a little bit more of a closed imaginative logic, but can also be very powerful. Whereas we were also just kind of in the more open side of, if you use theater as a method and you stage, similar to Theater of Oppressed, if you stage these difficult or oppressive relations, or how we're staging meetings in problematic ways, and then you use theater to actually experiment with how that could be different. So you're not necessarily going in with a predetermined idea of what the solution is, but you're using the method of theater to experiment and come up with new ideas. And I would say in this course, we did definitely a combination of both of those, but it was interesting. Also, maybe some of the tensions that we experienced between, like, how much do you let ideas or concepts lead, and how much do you really let the method lead in terms of imagination? And it's not always so straightforward. And I won't really get into this map, but we also experimented with the power of mapping as an imaginative method, where different people's ideas of possible desirable parts of rural futures. What does it look like when we kind of put those all together in a creative map space that doesn't have to be coherent, but can be a really creative way of people exploring different ideas about what rural futures might entail, also through the power of metaphor. And yeah, just to briefly share an example of this more open logic, like I think there's an even more open disruptive logic that can underpin the role of art and how it relates to science, where it's actually much more kind of disruptive of our dominant imaginaries and how we do things, but doesn't necessarily like suggest a very specific, like maybe closed logic is more saying like this is what the world should be like. And I think open logic is more so just trying to provoke or disrupt the way that we think about things. I would say this is kind of what we tried to do in a way at the start of the IST conference last August. For those who were there, if you didn't experience it, you can also go to that link to watch a whole video of the performance. And yeah, while I would say this also shows the tension between this closed and more open logic, because I probably going into designing this, I had some more particular ideas of what might work well or be powerful. But I really also give credit to so Steve Williams, who you see there, are the electronic artist. He like really kind of wanted to keep things much more open and said, let's just get together, also with Noor, my friend who I mentioned earlier, and let's just experiment with music together, making music together, because we hadn't made that at all, the three of us. So we had a retreat and we just kind of played around also much more openly. Music as a method to imagine and think about and explore these themes. And of course, we had certain concepts that were driving how we designed this or how we engaged with it, but it led to all sorts of kind of unexpected things to come out, such as the fact that I was unintentionally in the retreat singing, because we didn't really have any words. I was just kind of singing do, do, do. But then I was singing, we listened to it, I was singing Doom. And then we thought, oh, that's really interesting that I've been singing Doom without even realizing it, because that's also kind of what we sometimes do as scientists as well, especially within the context of sustainability transitions. So for us, that was kind of an interesting way of disrupting, in a way, the typical start of an academic conference that tends to be very much within maybe more logical or rational frames. And how can we kind of create a completely different sort of feeling at the start of a conference that opens up more spaces, hopefully, for different entry points into feeling and thinking about sustainability transitions. And this is just a very quick clip from the workshop that happened afterwards, because I was also just really blown away by the fact that the participants that just kind of decided to show up to this session were so willing to just completely get into a different mode of being and relating compared to like the more standard presentations that were happening simultaneously. So I'll just play a very quick clip. Again. And so I think there are so many different ways that we can push the boundaries now between artistic research practice. I've given a range of examples of how I've been experimenting with it, but there are so many inspirational things that people are doing around the power of theater. I've just listed two really interesting examples here: Empatheater and Drama Labs. Also prefiguration, so really kind of experimenting with this in our daily practice, such as the Living Streets movement, where they turn, for example, roads that cars normally drive down for a week or a month into, for example, a green space or a social space, to experiment actually how the use of that public space is completely different. And I think we really need more of these artistic social experiments in our daily practices, or there's really a risk that it remains completely disconnected from that. Also, as you can probably already tell from my examples, I'm really interested in the power of music and sound, because I think very often with imagination or transitions, we tend to be caught up really in the visual. And we really undervalue the power of music and sound for feeling and connecting, because it gives you a completely different sort of entry point. And finally, I'm really interested in how we can push the boundaries of how radical we can think about imagination from a collective sense. And one of the most inspiring speculative fiction writers, at least that I find, is Ursula Le Guin, and how she is able to imagine so radically otherwise, but then also does so in such an open way where it's not so clear cut what she's saying is good or bad, but she really allows you to engage with the complexity of how and the ethical dimensions of how it's not so clear cut, these alternative possible societies. And so just to close, I think that the power of art is really to unpack these conflicting imaginaries that keep us socially and politically divided so that we can experiment with possibilities for reconnection. And I just wanted to leave you with some gifts. So these are two books that are especially interesting when you think about the power of creativity, which you can follow up with. These are two books that I also love a lot. So Art Activism for an Anti-Colonial Future, and also Truth is Concrete, which I think provides some really interesting artistic strategies in politics. And last but not least, if you just really want to know some basics in terms of how do I integrate art into my research, you can see Method Meets Art, which goes into all sorts of different artistic forms. But if you're also wondering, like, how do I analyze data? How do I write this up? This other book, Creative Research Methods in the Social Sciences, is really helpful from that perspective. Yes, so I will leave it there because I know we've got limited time, so people can ask any questions they're curious about.